This is part of the summer series of Saints and Sermons about women, by women, brought to you by the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Baltimore, Maryland. Our preacher is the Reverend Dina van Klaveren, Canon for Stewardship and Development.
Please be seated. I'm not much of a gambler, friends, but I'm going to place a little bet that the children are not studying the lesson from Judges today. Wow, I am so honored to be here as you celebrate the role of women in the church. I was raised up in this congregation like so many fine clergy and lay leaders, our diocese and beyond. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really excited that we've got this text from Judges. So thank you for that. Thank you, Dean Rob. Today's readings, we might say, start off with a bang. Right? Got it? Got it? You were paying attention, right? If ever there's a time to be really focused on the readings. Today's reading starts off with a bang as this certain woman, unnamed, of Thebez, threw, I don't know if she had to throw so much. Maybe she had to get the angle. This is perfect for this. Threw an upper millstone on the head of Abimelech. He was the disinherited son of the famous Gideon, and he was absolutely obsessed with his image and having power like the Canaanites had power for their leaders. And so he was going around and attacking people that did not agree with him, and that's how he ends up at this tower. Thank God they had the tower. Thank God that people before them thought it would be good for us to build a tower for safety's sake, because they could gather in that tower. And they were gathered there in opposition to Abimelech when this certain woman ended the deadly rampage. And his obsession with his image, with his status, with his reputation is so strong that even though he has had his skull crushed, the thing on his mind is not getting right with God, okay? It is that he doesn't want to be remembered as the guy who was killed by a woman. Right? We can just tell that throughout, to the very end, his priorities were a little off. And so here we are, remembering Abimelech, who was killed by a woman defending her people. I'm not really prone to violence in a sermon, and yet that is the story that is passed down to us. And not only was he killed by a woman, friends, he was so obsessed with his image that he turned to some young man and asked that man to do more violence to him for his reputation. It's really pitiful, isn't it? That obsession, that just obsession on his ego, on his legacy. And that's how we start off our readings today. Knocking out Abimelech. And then we move to Luke's gospel where we have knocking on the door of a neighbor. And then we look at the lives of three amazing women from the 1800s whose strength and resolve and action and hope and confidence and power, true power, paved the way to knock down obstacles and set God's people truly free. Today we celebrate and remember the lives of Sojourner Truth and Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and that's a lot to pack into today, so I'm going to do my best to just move through it, okay? We explore these texts and we look at their lives and their legacies, and then we do that thing we always do when we gather together and hear good news. We consider what we're called to do in response. I'm glad that our second lesson is from my favorite gospel of Luke. Luke beautifully lifts up the value, the inherent value of women in society, their actions, their inclusion in community, and takes note of people that are pushed out of society and the center of community because of certain identities. That feels really right for me in this place at this moment. to be reading Luke's gospel together. So I want to say a quick word about being in this place. Some of you were here when my husband Dave and I first ventured into the cathedral from our apartment in Charles Village. We chose the service because it started late. I'm not going to lie. I think it was 10:30, and that was just right for us. So thank you for that. And we came in through those glass doors, and I don't think I've ever used that entrance since. So that was the first and only time. We worshiped here for the first time in 1997, and that following year at the Great Vigil of Easter, we were received into the Episcopal Church. It's a joy to be a part and to consider this my spiritual home, this community that mirrors that aspect of Luke's gospel that pulls people in. People that are perhaps isolated are invited and welcomed in. That is the legacy of this congregation, of this space. So I have to tell you that when we left here in 2003 to go to Berkeley, California, so I could attend seminary at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, I was in for a shock when I started worshiping in other congregations. You kind of ruined me. I went out to check out where I might want to do field ed, and I was just shocked. I was so naive. I thought every Episcopal church worshiped and sang in different languages and sent their youth on spiritual pilgrimages and dared to speak truth to power when children were being harmed by the violence in the city and people were not paying attention. This legacy of social justice is so beautiful, and I walked into every Episcopal congregation expecting to find this. And so what I want to say is I'm grateful that I was naive. I'm grateful that I had been shaped to expect what is so normal and beautiful in this place, what feels so right here. As I serve on the bishop's staff here in Diocesan Center, hey, Bishop. You're such a supportive sermon listener, too. This is so good. So as I serve on staff now at the Diocesan Center, I want to let you know that you have, as a congregation, created a kind of Luke's gospel, inclusive, hospitality, social justice, speaking truth to power blueprint on my life, on my mind, and in my heart. And that as I go out to different congregations and celebrate the gifts that they have in their congregation, I'm always mindful of what I know to be true in this place, the legacy of love and justice here at the Cathedral. So, back to the gospel. This congregation, the Cathedral of the Incarnation, matches that tone of Luke's gospel, where just a few verses before this story about knocking on your neighbor's door, we have Jesus entering the home of Martha, not Lazarus. It was considered Martha's home. That's significant to us today. And Jesus is showing in that text through his words and actions that he holds women in high regard. Not only is he entering and staying at the home of Martha, Jesus sees, as he talks with the sisters, that women can do more than stay out of sight and work to provide for the needs of the men. There's the Mary way and the Martha way. There's more than one way. In Luke chapter 11, our text for today, Jesus employs an illustration of ancient Middle Eastern hospitality that relied heavily on neighbors and a system of honor and shame to motivate good behavior in community. In that context, the sleepy neighbor inside would of course eventually rouse himself and hand over some bread to the one knocking. Otherwise, their name would be dragged through the mud by noon the next day. To help offer hospitality gained a person honor. To refuse it brought about absolute shame. Thus, a persistent person knocking on a door of a grouchy neighbor who would rather not be inconvenienced at such a late hour has confidence that they will eventually open the door and do the right thing, share their bread. Sojourner, Amelia, and Elizabeth led this country in persistently knocking on God's door and on the doors of God's people with such confidence, calling forth a more just society. Some of that they did not live to see. They lifted up the rights and inherent value of women at a time when women could neither vote, nor buy a home, nor attend school as easily as men, nor divorce an abusive and badly behaving husband, and on and on and on and on. And so they knocked and they knocked and they knocked on the doors of people's hearts and minds and consciences until obstacles were knocked over and society eventually did the right thing and began to change for the better, opening the doors for generations who followed. Now, I'm sure that they had their dark night of the soul, their cynical moments, their struggles, and yet they kept knocking. That's good news for us. We have moments in which we struggle and don't know if it's worth it, and we keep knocking. We don't give in to the cynicism. Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the American Equal Rights Association and the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. That was the first convention, the first big gathering for the sole purpose of discussing women's rights. Amelia Jenks Bloomer, she knocked down oppressive fashion. I'm wearing pants today in her honor. Ladies, if you're wearing pants, you have Amelia to thank today. Can you imagine I just can't even imagine not having that option. She reformed styles of dress. It's hard for us to imagine this, but she reformed styles of dress that posed actual health hazards for women, for their bodies. She suggested, and this was scandalous, that women ditch their corsets and their long skirts and instead try to wear pantaloons so that the female body was less restricted, so that women could, for example, just one, ascend the stairs at night with a candle in one hand and maybe a child in the other, and not having to hike up the big skirts so that you don't fall down the stairs with the baby, hurting yourself, hurting the baby, and maybe lighting the house on fire. It seems pretty smart and practical, right? It was scandalous to people, scandalous. Elizabeth and Amelia were white women with educated men in their households. The women's rights movement began among women of access and privilege in New York State. Historian Nell Irvin Painter says it best. At a time when most Americans thought of slaves as male and women as white, Sojourner Truth embodied a fact that still bears repeating. Among the blacks are women, among the women there are blacks. That had to be said out loud for people. That still has to be said out loud for us, especially when we look at the feminist movement. There's much work out there, many books to read on this topic. How a movement has forgotten a whole section of its people within the movement. Sojourner Truth was an itinerant preacher, abolitionist, and women's rights activist. She knew how to speak truth to power. Born Isabella Baumtree in New York and enslaved to a prominent Dutch-American family, her first language was Dutch. When she was sold at 9 years old to an English-speaking household, she was treated very badly for not understanding their demands in English. She learned English, and she had a Dutch accent for her whole life. When the man who owned her did not emancipate her as he had promised to do, she emancipated herself by walking to freedom. And along the way, she experienced a spiritual renewal and was compelled to change her name to Sojourner Truth. Friends, you may know this, but I was shocked to discover this week that the 1851 speech that many of us learned in school, "Ain't I a Woman?" Anybody learn that in school? I was shocked to learn that the version I learned of that speech was inaccurate. The truer version was penned a few weeks after she gave the speech, while the version that was in my history book in high school that many of us learned was written 12 years later and sought to make Sojourner Truth sound more like what white people expected to hear from a formerly enslaved person of African descent. It reminds me of the movie American Fiction. The relevance continues. Sojourner Truth's liberating legacy invites us into a space that many are calling, and beautifully so, intersectionality. Intersectionality, a framework that helps us understand how multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage can overlap and create hefty obstacles for people with multiple identities. Luke's gospel, a certain woman in Thebes with a millstone in her hands, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Amelia Bloomer, and Sojourner Truth invite us into this space of intersectionality, into this godly blueprint for justice and goodness in this broken world. We learn from those who have gone before to knock and knock and knock until those obstacles are overcome, until the doors finally open for everyone. Some of us today are called to persistently pray to God that those doors will open to justice. And some of us today are called to persistently and publicly advocate for leaders and systems to open the doors to justice where they are firmly shut, to participate in programs like The Color of Love, Climate Justice Action, and the work of resettling refugees. Some of us are called to get up out of our cozy slumber of privilege and to instead be willing to be inconvenienced for the needs of our neighbors, so that all of God's people in all of our various identities and cultures and experiences can know the deep hospitality of God's love and have no barrier between them and the experience of beloved community.